The first time Margaret Brenner found a cord of firewood stacked against her fence post, she thought the wind had carried somebody else's timber to her doorstep, which was precisely the kind of foolish thinking that loneliness could produce in a woman living alone on the Montana frontier in the autumn of 1878. She stood on the porch of the small homestead she had inherited from her late husband, Thomas Brenner, a man who had died of fever 3 months after staking their claim in the foothills east of the Bitterroot Range. Thomas had been a good man, a gentle man, the sort of man who read scripture aloud on Sunday evenings and always remembered her birthday. But he had not been a strong man, and the frontier did not forgive weakness in any form, whether it lived in the lungs or in the character. He was buried behind the house beneath a wooden cross that Margaret had driven into the hard earth herself, using the back of a hatchet because she could not find the mallet in the confusion of grief. 3 months a widow, Margaret had learned to do everything herself. She had learned to patch the roof when a branch came down in a windstorm. She had learned to reset a fence post when the ground heaved in the early freeze. She had learned to bake bread by feel and memory because she had burned the first 4 loaves and could not afford to burn a 5th. She had learned to carry water from the creek and to skin rabbits and to sleep through the sounds that the night made when it pressed itself against the cabin walls, but she had not learned to cut and stack enough firewood to last a Montana winter. The territory was unforgiving in November. The cold came down from the mountains like something alive, something with teeth, and it did not retreat until well into April. A woman alone on 12 acres needed more wood than she could reasonably produce with 1 axe and 2 arms that ached by midday. Margaret had been calculating the deficit in her head every evening, adding up what she had against what she would need, and the numbers never balanced. So on that October morning in 1878, when she walked out to check the fence line and found a full cord of split pine stacked neat and tight against the post, she stood in the cold air and simply stared at it. The wood was good quality. The splits were even. Someone had taken time with it. She looked down the road that wound east through the pines toward the town of Harlan Creek, a rough settlement of 400 souls that called itself a town primarily because it had a general store, a livery, a telegraph office, and a saloon that did more business than all the other establishments combined. She saw no wagon. She saw no tracks she could readily follow in the frost. The wood was simply there, as if it had always been there, as if the mountain had offered it up. Margaret walked around the stack twice, examining it the way she might examine something that could be a gift or could be a threat, because in 1878 Montana, the line between those two things was not always clearly drawn. She decided to be grateful. She spent the rest of that day bringing the wood inside, stacking it along the interior wall, and feeding the iron stove that sat in the center of the single main room of the cabin. That evening the cabin was warmer than it had been in weeks, and she sat by the stove with her mending in her lap and a cup of tea at her elbow, and felt something she had not felt since Thomas died. She felt like she might be all right. Albert Langston had been watching the Brenner homestead from the ridge above it for 2 weeks before he decided to bring the wood. He was not a man who made decisions quickly. He was not a man who made decisions in the way that most people understood the word, which was to say, he did not sit down and reason through a thing and arrive at a logical conclusion. He felt his way to decisions the way a blind man felt his way along a wall, one hand flat against the surface, trusting the texture of it. He was 34 years old, which in the context of his life meant he had been living alone in the mountains since he was 19, and had come to regard solitude not as a condition, but as a preference. He had a cabin 3 miles up the ridge, a structure he had built himself over the course of 2 summers, tight and solid, and fitted with a good stone chimney that drew clean in any wind. He had 2 mules, a gray named Hector and a brown named Pease, and a dog, a large and indifferent hound named Columbus who mostly slept by the fire and occasionally flushed rabbits out of the brush when the mood took him. Albert was what the people in Harlan Creek called a mountain man, which was their way of describing someone who had chosen the high country over civilization and had the self-sufficiency to sustain that choice. He came down to town perhaps 4 times a year for supplies he could not produce himself, primarily gunpowder, coffee, and flour. He traded furs in the spring. He was known to the townspeople primarily as a large, quiet figure who conducted his business without lingering and rode back up the mountain without socializing. He was not unfriendly. He was simply accustomed to silence the way other men were accustomed to conversation. He had come to know about the Brenner property because the ridge above it offered the best overlook of the valley below, and he had used that overlook for years to watch the weather coming in from the west. Thomas Brenner had built his cabin on good ground, south-facing and sheltered on 2 sides, and Albert had watched the man and his wife move into it in the spring of 1878, with the mild interest he took in all changes to the landscape. He had watched Thomas Brenner die in July, not literally but practically, because he had seen the wagon going toward town with what looked like a very ill man lying in the bed of it, and he had seen the wagon come back with a coffin-shaped wooden box. He had watched Margaret Brenner bury her husband. He had watched her from a distance that made it impossible to see her face but close enough to understand the shape of a woman's grief in the set of her shoulders. He had watched her through August and September, not with any intention, but with the attentiveness that living alone in the wilderness produced. You watched everything. You cataloged everything. The health of the forest, the behavior of the creek, the state of the road, the condition of your neighbors, even if your neighbors were 2 miles distant and you had never spoken to them. In October, he noticed that the woodpile at the Brenner homestead was inadequate. He knew what a Montana winter required and what that stack represented, and the arithmetic was simple, and the conclusion was straightforward. The woman would be cold before January and might not survive February if she did not have more fuel. Albert Langston did not consider himself a charitable man. He did not think of himself in terms of character at all, really. But he thought clearly and he acted on what he thought. And what he thought in the 3rd week of October 1878 was that a woman alone on a mountain should not freeze to death when he had a ridge full of pine and the means to cut it and deliver it. He did not knock on her door. He was not sure why. It was not shyness exactly, though he had not spoken to a woman in perhaps 18 months and the prospect was not comfortable. It was more that knocking on the door would require explanation and conversation and a whole apparatus of social exchange that he did not feel equipped to manage. Leaving the wood spoke for itself. The wood said, "You will be warm." The wood asked nothing back. He loaded Hector and peas in the dark hours before dawn and brought a cord of split pine down the ridge and stacked it against her fence post, and rode back up the mountain before the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline. He told himself he would not do it again. He did it again the following week. He came down on a Tuesday before daylight with another load. He moved quietly. He stacked the wood the same way, tight and neat, and he turned the mules around and started back up the trail. He was perhaps 50 yards from the property line when he stopped. There was something on the fence post. He had not seen it in the dark when he arrived because it had not been there in the dark when he arrived. It had been left after his first delivery, which meant she had put it there deliberately, which meant she knew someone was coming. He dismounted from Hector and walked back to the fence. On the top of the post, wrapped in a piece of brown cloth and tied with a length of kitchen string, was something that smelled extraordinary. He stood in the cold pre-dawn air and held the bundle in his big hands and breathed in the smell of it, which was buttery and warm and faintly sweet. Biscuits. She had left him biscuits. He unwrapped the cloth carefully, as if the biscuits themselves were fragile, which they were not. There were 4 of them, golden brown and slightly crisp on the outside, and he could tell from the weight and the smell that they would be soft in the middle. He ate one standing at the fence post, and it was so good, so genuinely and simply good, that he stood very still for a moment and did not think about anything at all. He put the remaining 3 in his coat pocket and rode back up the mountain. He ate one on the trail while Hector picked his careful way through the frost-covered rocks. He ate another at midday sitting outside his cabin in a rare patch of November sun with Columbus sleeping at his feet. He saved the last one until evening and ate it slowly beside his fire. He thought about her hands making them. He thought about her knowing he would come. He thought about the careful way she had wrapped them in the brown cloth and tied the string in a bow. He did not sleep very well that night. Margaret did not know why she had left the biscuits. Or rather, she knew the practical reason, which was gratitude, and she knew the slightly less practical reason, which was curiosity, and she suspected there was a third reason she was not quite ready to examine. She had been baking anyway. She baked every Thursday, a habit from before Thomas died, because Thursday baking meant fresh bread through the weekend and biscuits for a week of breakfasts. She had made an extra 4 biscuits the Thursday after the first delivery, wrapped them while they were still warm, and walked out to the fence post with the bundle. She had hesitated before setting it down. She did not know who was leaving the wood. She had asked around in town when she made her monthly supply run, and old Berta Hollies at the general store had thought about it, and said it might be Albert Langston from up on the ridge, because he was the kind of man who did quiet things without explanation, and because he had access to timber and a strong back and a personality that was more likely to leave gifts anonymously than to walk up and introduce himself. Margaret had asked what Albert Langston was like. Berta had said he was a mountain man, large and quiet, and that he had been up on that ridge since before the town was properly established. She said he was reliable in the way that geography was reliable. He was there when you needed a reference point, and he did not cause trouble, and that was more than you could say for most men. Margaret had thought about that description on the ride home. Reliable in the way that geography was reliable. She liked it. She set the biscuits on the fence post and went back inside and told herself she was simply being polite. She woke very early the following Tuesday and sat at the dark window of the cabin and watched. She could not see clearly through the pre-dawn darkness, but she could see movement against the white frost, the shape of a large man and 2 mules, and the systematic arrangement of wood against her fence. He was methodical. He moved without waste. She watched him finish the stack and turn the mules, and she watched him walk back toward the trail. He was very large. She could see that even at a distance. Wide at the shoulder, easy in his movements despite the size. She watched him stop at the fence post. She watched him unwrap the cloth. She watched him stand very still for a moment. She felt an odd warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. The weeks passed and the arrangement continued. Every Tuesday before dawn, Albert brought a cord of wood and stacked it against the fence. Every Thursday, Margaret left biscuits on the fence post wrapped in brown cloth tied with kitchen string. The wood accumulated along the south wall of the cabin, and Margaret began to feel genuinely secure about her winter supply for the first time since Thomas died. She changed up the biscuits occasionally. Some weeks she added a small crock of honey tucked beside the bundle. One week she made cornbread instead, wrapping it in the same cloth, wondering if he would approve of the variation. Another week she included a small jar of her blackberry preserves. Albert ate everything. He ate it on the ride back up the mountain, which had become a ritual he found himself looking forward to with an anticipation that surprised him. He had not thought of himself as someone who anticipated things. He had thought of himself as someone who simply existed in the present moment, fully occupied by it. But on Tuesday mornings now, he noticed that he had an awareness of what was coming, a leaning toward the moment when he would find what she had left. He tried the honey on a biscuit one Tuesday afternoon sitting outside his cabin in the brittle November sunlight, drizzling it from the small crock, and he thought that it was possibly the finest thing he had ever eaten, which was not entirely about the honey. Columbus approved of the cornbread and ate a piece before Albert could stop him, and Albert could not bring himself to be too stern about it because he understood the impulse. In December, the first heavy snow came down and the world went white, and the trail from the ridge to the valley became difficult for the mules. Albert brought extra loads. He brought 2 cords in 1 week because the snow made travel uncertain and he wanted her stocked. He broke trail with Hector in the lead and Peas following and arrived at the fence line in the gray light of early morning with his beard frosted and his coat stiff with cold. She had left the biscuits wrapped in the brown cloth as always, but she had also left, tucked beside the bundle, a second cloth that turned out to be a heavy knitted scarf in dark green wool. Albert held the scarf and looked at it for a long time. It was good work. The stitches were tight and even and the wool was thick. He put it on standing at the fence post, and it was warm immediately against his throat and the bottom of his jaw. He stood in the snow beside the stacked wood with the green scarf around his neck, and he understood that something was happening that he did not have adequate language for. He rode home with the scarf on, and the biscuits in his pocket and Columbus trotting alongside the mules, and he thought about language, specifically about the fact that he and Margaret Brenner had conducted 6 weeks of exchange without a single word spoken, without a single word written, and had nonetheless managed to communicate something that felt important and clear and real. He was not sure what to do about that. He was sure that he needed to do something. The decision came to him the way his decisions always came, which was to say it arrived fully formed one morning when he was not looking for it. He was splitting wood behind his own cabin, the axe coming down in the clean, rhythmic way that he found satisfying, and he simply understood that he was going to go down to the Brenner homestead on a day that was not Tuesday, and he was going to knock on the door, and he was going to speak. He spent 2 days thinking about what to say. He decided to say his name, and that he hoped the wood was sufficient. He spent another day thinking about whether that was enough. He decided it was a beginning. It was a Thursday in mid-December when he rode Hector down the ridge in daylight, which felt extraordinary in itself, because he had always been a creature of darkness and early morning in relation to her property. The sun was low and white in the winter sky, and the snow lay deep and clean on everything, and the world had the quality of a held breath. He stopped Hector at the gate and climbed down and tied the reins to the post. The fence post still had a small piece of brown cloth tied to it from Tuesday, the string hanging loose. He had taken the biscuits, but apparently she had not retrieved the cloth. He walked to the door and stood in front of it for a moment. He knocked. Margaret Brenner opened the door wearing an apron dusted with flour and her dark hair pinned up but coming loose on one side, which he noticed with the precise cataloging attention that years of wilderness living had built into him. The way you noticed every detail of a landscape because any detail might be important. She was not at all what he had constructed in his imagination, which was to say she was more vivid than his imagination had managed. She had dark eyes, very direct, the kind of eyes that looked at you rather than past you. She was of medium height and she had the capable hands of a woman who worked constantly, the knuckles weathered, the movements efficient. She looked at him and did not say anything immediately, which he found he appreciated because it gave him a moment to collect himself. He said, "My name is Albert Langston. I live up on the ridge. I have been bringing the wood." She looked at him for another moment and then she said, "I know. Berta Hollies told me it was likely you." And then she said, "I am Margaret Brenner. Would you like to come in?" He had not thought past the introduction. He said yes. The inside of the cabin was warm and smelled of biscuits and pine, and something faintly sweet he thought might be the blackberry preserves. It was a single main room with a cooking area near the stove, and a table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair near the window, and a curtained alcove he took to be the sleeping area. It was orderly and spare, and had the quality of a place that was genuinely lived in rather than simply occupied. He sat in one of the chairs at the table because she gestured to it, and he was not sure what else to do with himself. He was aware of his own size in the small space, the way he was too large for the chair, and for the room in a way that was not uncomfortable but was noticeable. She put a cup of coffee in front of him without asking, which was the right thing to do. He wrapped his hands around it and was grateful for the warmth. She sat across from him with her own cup, and for a moment they simply sat with the sound of the stove between them, which should have been awkward but was not quite, because they had been in a kind of conversation for 6 weeks already, even if the medium had been wood and biscuits rather than words. He said, "The scarf is very warm. I wore it this morning." She said, "I am glad." "I was not sure of the size," he said. "It fits exactly." She looked at her coffee cup. She said, "You did not need to bring so much wood, you know. I don't want you to think I cannot manage. I was managing." He said, "I know. But the winter is hard and you should not have to manage alone when there is timber on the ridge and someone with the means to bring it." She looked at him then in a way that was neither grateful nor defensive but something more direct than either, as if she were taking a measurement. She said, "Why did you never knock before today?" He thought about this carefully because it deserved a careful answer. He said, "I was not sure you would want me to. And then once the exchange was established, I was not sure how to change it without disrupting something that seemed to be working." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "The biscuits. Were they all right?" He said. "They were the best thing I ate in months." She laughed, which was unexpected, a real laugh, brief and warm, and he felt the sound of it in his chest the way you felt the first real thaw of spring, which was to say it was a relief of a sort you had almost forgotten you needed. After that Thursday, the arrangement changed shape without losing its essential character. The wood still came on Tuesdays. The biscuits still appeared. But now, occasionally, Albert came on a Thursday afternoon when the weather permitted, and sat at the table and drank coffee, and they talked. The talking was something he had not expected to be good at with her. He had assumed that the many years of solitude had stripped him of ordinary conversation, which it had in a certain way. He could not make small talk. He could not gossip or joke in the manner of the men who gathered at the saloon in Harlan Creek. But with Margaret, he found that what they did was not quite small talk anyway. They talked about practical things, about the condition of the trail, about the behavior of the winter, about the mules and the dog, about her chickens, which she kept in a small pen beside the cabin and which were the source of considerable drama because Columbus had discovered them on his second visit and had to be firmly redirected by Albert in a moment of considerable mutual embarrassment. They talked about Thomas, briefly. She mentioned him in the way you mention a thing that is settled rather than ongoing, with acknowledgement and without the raw edge of fresh grief. Albert understood that she had done the work of mourning and had arrived somewhere on the other side of it, which was not forgetting but was something more functional. He mentioned, on his own behalf, very little about his past beyond the simple facts. He had come west from Ohio at 19 after his father's farm had been sold for debts. He had spent several years as a trapper and fur trader in the Northern Territories and had eventually settled on the ridge because it suited him. He had been alone a long time. She asked if he found it lonely. He said he had not until recently. She looked at him when he said that and then looked away at the window, at the snow coming down outside, and he could not tell what she was thinking. In January, the cold deepened, and the snow came heavily enough that the trail from the ridge became genuinely dangerous, and Albert spent a solid 10 days without coming down. He kept the fire in his cabin burning through the nights and worked at the repairs he had been putting off, recaulking the gaps between the logs, resetting a hinge on the door, reshaping a snowshoe that had cracked. Columbus spent all of January on the hearthrug in a state of philosophical indifference to the weather outside. Albert thought about Margaret through those 10 days with a regularity and specificity that he recognized as significant. He thought about whether she was warm enough. He had left her with enough wood for 2 months of hard use, so he was fairly confident on that count. But he thought about the other things too, the small things, whether she had enough coffee, whether the chickens were producing through the cold, whether the cabin roof was holding under the snow load. He thought about her laugh. He thought about the way she tilted her head slightly to the right when she was listening to something carefully, as if she were making sure she was receiving the full frequency of the thing. He thought about the green scarf, which he wore every day now and would have worn to bed if it had not seemed excessive. When the trail cleared enough to travel, he came down on a Tuesday with the wood and found the Biscuits waiting. And in addition to the Biscuits, there was a note, the first written communication in their entire exchange. It was written in a firm, clear hand on a piece of paper that had been folded twice and tucked under the string of the bundle. The note said, "I hope the trail was not too dangerous. The chickens were not happy, but I kept them through it. Come Thursday if the weather holds." He read it twice standing in the cold. He came Thursday. She had made soup, a thick bean soup with a piece of salt pork he suspected she had been saving. She put a bowl in front of him and sat across from him, and they ate together, which they had not done before. The act of eating at the same table felt different from sitting with coffee, more domestic and intimate, and he was aware of it without knowing how to articulate it. He said, "The soup is very good." She said, "It needed more salt pork, but I was running low. The general store supply run is not until the end of the month." He said, "I can bring things from town. I go to Harlan Creek every few weeks. You can give me a list." She looked at him across the table. She said, "You would do that?" He said, "Of course." She said, "I don't want to be a burden to you, Albert." It was the first time she had used his first name. He had used hers at her invitation since December. He was aware of the shift in the same way he was aware of a change in wind direction. He said, "You are not a burden. You are my neighbor." She accepted this with a small nod and went back to her soup, and he thought that she was the kind of person who accepted kindness without making too great a production of it, which was a quality he found deeply comfortable. February arrived in Montana with a fury that Albert had seen before and respected. The temperatures dropped to numbers that were almost abstract, cold so profound it hurt the lungs to breathe outside. He came down twice in February with wood despite the conditions, bundled so heavily against the wind that only his eyes were visible, and he stayed longer on those visits because the storm was bad enough that it was foolish to push back up the trail immediately. On the second February visit, the storm closed down around midday while he was sitting at her table, and the visibility dropped to nearly nothing. She told him flatly that he could sleep in front of the stove because no one with good sense rode up a mountain in a whiteout, and she was not going to have his death on her conscience. He spent the night on a bedroll she produced from the chest under the sleeping alcove, with Columbus curled against his legs and the stove keeping the room at a remarkable temperature. He lay in the dark and listened to the storm hitting the cabin walls, and thought that this was perhaps the most content he had ever been, which was information he was not sure what to do with. In the morning she made coffee and eggs from the chickens that had survived the winter, and she made biscuits, and the smell of them in the warm cabin while the storm still raged outside was something Albert kept with him like a carried thing for a long time afterward. They talked that morning at a different depth than they had before. Perhaps it was the storm, which created a kind of enclosure, a sense of the world contracted to the size of the room and everything within it. Perhaps it was the strangeness of the morning-after intimacy of sleeping in the same space. She told him about coming west from Illinois with Thomas in the spring of 1878, about how she had believed in the project of the homestead with a completeness that had surprised her, because she had not thought of herself as a woman built for hard places. She said she had found that she was more built for hard places than she had known, which was both a gift and a sorrow because she would have preferred to discover it another way. He told her about Ohio, about the farm his father had lost, about the older brother who had gone to Cincinnati and made a different kind of life, and with whom Albert had not spoken in many years, not out of animosity, but out of the simple divergence of two lives that had taken opposite directions. She asked if he regretted coming west. He looked across the table at her, at the snow light coming through the window and catching in her dark eyes, and he said no. He said he had not regretted it, and increasingly he felt the rightness of it, the sense that his life had been accumulating towards something without his knowing what. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked down at her coffee cup, and there was a quality to that moment, a held tension, that made him think they were both aware of something that neither of them was quite ready to say directly. March came, and the snow began to ease, and the world started its slow return to something recognizable as livable. The melt made the trail treacherous in a different way, muddy and unstable, but Albert managed it with the patience he had built over 15 years of mountain living. He came down on a Thursday in early March and found Margaret outside for the first time, working at the fence line with a hammer and a handful of nails. A section of the fence had shifted under the snow load, and she was resetting it with the methodical competence he had come to expect from her. She looked up when she heard Hector on the trail, and she straightened and pushed a strand of dark hair out of her face. She said, "The fence is being difficult." He tied Hector to the post and rolled up his sleeves despite the cold and said, "Show me." They worked together on the fence for an hour, Albert resetting the posts that had heaved out of the ground and Margaret driving the nails and refitting the rails. They worked without talking much, which was comfortable. He handed her things when she needed them, and she directed the work with a quiet authority that he found he responded to naturally, without the friction that cooperation with strangers usually produced in him. When the fence was fixed, she stood back and assessed it and said, "That will hold," he said, "until the next heavy frost." She said, "Then we will fix it again." The words sat in the air between them for a moment. He looked at her and she looked at him, and she did not take it back. They went inside for coffee, and she told him that old Berta Hollies had spoken to her at the general store about a community gathering planned for the end of March, a social event in the saloon's back room that was organized each year to celebrate the end of the worst of winter. There would be music, apparently, and food that people brought, and most of Harlan Creek would attend. She said she was considering whether to go. He said, "Would you like to go?" She said she was not sure. She had not gone anywhere social since Thomas died, and the prospect was complicated. He said, "I could take you if you wanted. I have the wagon." She looked at him with an expression he was starting to learn, which was the one where she was evaluating whether something was a good idea while she was already fairly certain of the answer. She said, "That would depend on whether you were planning to go yourself." He had not been planning to go. He had not attended the end-of-winter gathering in years, but he said, "I am planning to go now." That almost smile again, the one she controlled but did not quite suppress. She said, "Then yes, I would like that." The gathering was on the last Saturday of March, and Albert came down from the ridge in the evening with the wagon, which he had cleaned out and lined with a piece of canvas to keep the worst of the cold off. Margaret came out of the cabin wearing a dark blue dress that he had not seen before, her hair pinned up properly, and for a moment he was aware of himself standing by the wagon in his good coat, which was still not a fine coat by any measure, and he hoped he was not a disappointment to her in a public context. She walked to the wagon, and he helped her up to the seat, and they drove into Harlan Creek in the cold March evening with the stars beginning to come out over the mountains. The gathering was loud and warm and smelled of tobacco and food, and the particular closeness of many people in a room that was not built for that many people. Albert was conscious of the attention they attracted, not extravagantly but steadily, the sideways looks and the quick conversations that stopped when he and Margaret approached and resumed when they passed. He understood what the looks meant. In a town of 400, a widow arriving at a social event with Albert Langston was information. He found that he did not mind. He minded things carefully selected, and this was not among them. Berta Hollies found them within the first 10 minutes and embraced Margaret with the comfortable authority of an older woman who had appointed herself responsible for the emotional welfare of the younger ones. She was a broad, warm woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a laugh that dominated any room she entered. She looked at Albert and said, "Albert Langston coming to the spring gathering. Now I have seen everything." He said, "Good evening, Berta." She said, "I understand you have been keeping Margaret in Firewood all winter." He said, "The mountain has the timber. It seemed wasteful not to use it." Berta looked at him with the knowing eyes of someone who had been watching human beings interact for decades and found them mostly transparent. She said, "Come have some food, both of you." There was music, a fiddle player from the livery and a man with a harmonica and a woman who played a small upright piano that had been hauled from somewhere on a wagon and was not entirely in tune, but made up for it in enthusiasm. People danced in the cleared center of the room. The dancing was vigorous and unsophisticated and thoroughly enjoyable to watch. Margaret watched it with a quality of attention that was half longing, and he noticed it. He said, "Do you dance?" She said, "I have not in a long time." Thomas was not much for it. She paused. "Do you?" He said, "I have not in a longer time." She laughed at that and said, "Then we are equally unpracticed." He said, "Would you like to try?" She looked at him and then at the dancing people and then at him again. She said, "Yes, I think I would." They were not good at it. He was too large to be properly graceful and she was out of practice with the steps. But the fiddle was playing something lively and the room was forgiving. And after the first minute of navigating their mutual inexpertness, they fell into a kind of rhythm that was not technically dancing, but was something in the neighborhood of it. Something warm and slightly breathless and entirely good. Her hand was in his, which was the first time they had touched, and he was aware of it with the precision of someone registering a significant new fact. She looked up at him while they were dancing, and she was smiling, genuinely, without the controlled quality that her smiles sometimes had, and he thought he had never seen anything in his life he would describe as beautiful more readily than that. After the dancing, they stood near the food table and ate cornbread and venison stew brought by various townspeople and talked to Berta and to the telegraph operator, a young man named Graves who was apparently well regarded for his reliability, and to the minister, Reverend Alcott, a lean gray-bearded man who shook Albert's hand with the sort of enthusiasm that suggested he thought mountain men were a demographic worth cultivating. On the drive back to the homestead in the late evening, with the stars enormous overhead and the cold pressing in around the warmth of the wool blanket Margaret had brought for the trip, she said, "Thank you for taking me." He said, "Thank you for coming." She said, "I had forgotten what it was like to be among people and enjoy it. I think I had started to think it was something I had given up." He understood that. He said, "It is easier with the right company." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Yes, it is." The spring came to the Bitterroot foothills the way it always did, tentatively at first and then with a sudden conviction, the snow retreating uphill, the ground softening, the pale green of new growth appearing in the south-facing meadows. Albert began to spend time at the homestead in the afternoons, not always for a specific purpose, but for the purpose of the thing itself, which was her company. He helped her with the spring planting. She had a kitchen garden behind the cabin, a rectangle of ground that Thomas had turned over and that she had maintained, and they worked at it together on a warm afternoon in April, Albert turning the soil while Margaret planned the layout with a focus that reminded him of someone drawing a map. She asked him about the ridge, about what he grew, and he described his small garden, the practical things, potatoes and turnips and some beans. And she said he should grow more variety, and told him which plants would do well at elevation, and which would fail in the shorter season. He wrote down what she said in the small notebook he kept in his coat pocket, which he used for practical notes about the mountain, weather patterns and animal behavior and supply needs, and it occurred to him only afterward that he had never written down anything a person had said to him in that notebook before. On a warm day in April, when they were both sitting on her porch in the afternoon sun, Columbus asleep in the dust at their feet and the chickens conducting their ongoing business in the pen, she said something that changed the quality of everything. She said, "Albert, what is this? Between us? What are we doing?" He looked at her and she was looking at him directly, with those direct dark eyes that he had learned did not allow for evasion. And he understood that she was not asking out of anxiety, but out of the same quality that characterized everything she did, which was a preference for clarity over comfortable vagueness. He was quiet for a moment, choosing words with the care he gave to everything important. He said, "I have been thinking about that for a while," she said, "and he said, I think I would like to court you, properly, if you would accept that." She looked at him for a long moment, and the spring wind moved through the pines at the edge of her property and Columbus twitched in his sleep. She said, "I think I have been accepting it since December, Albert." He looked at her and understood that this was the most direct thing that had passed between them yet, and that it called for something equally direct. He said, "Then I will not pretend I have not felt the same since around the time of the green scarf." She laughed again, the real laugh, and he felt it in his chest again as he always did. And this time he also took her hand, which was resting on the arm of the porch chair, and she turned her palm up and held his hand back. They stayed that way for a long time in the afternoon sun, with the mountains around them and Columbus sleeping and the chickens in their pen. And Albert Langston thought that 15 years alone on a mountain had been exactly the right preparation for understanding what it meant to not be alone. Spring advanced into summer, and Albert came down from the ridge with increasing regularity, not weekly but several times a week, and the texture of what existed between him and Margaret developed into something that he could only describe as belonging. He belonged at her table and she belonged in his thoughts, and the two things were related. He told her about the ridge in detail that he had never shared with anyone, about the places he had learned over 15 years, the high meadow where the elk gathered in September, the spring that ran cold and clean even in dry years, the hollow tree that was home to a family of raccoons he had been inadvertently feeding since they figured out where he kept his dried corn. She listened to all of it with the tilted head attentiveness he had come to love and asked questions that demonstrated she had been listening carefully and was genuinely interested rather than politely so. She told him things she had not told him before. About her parents in Illinois, both gone now, her mother of consumption when Margaret was 16 and her father of a stroke 3 years later. About the sister in St. Louis who wrote letters that arrived 2 months delayed and were full of concerns about Margaret's situation that were well-meaning and entirely uninformed by any knowledge of the actual conditions. About what she wanted, which was the homestead, the land, the mountains, the particular quality of the light in the evenings and the smell of the pine and the silence that was never actually silent but was filled with the right kinds of sound. She said, "I did not come here to leave. I came here to stay. Thomas knew that. I just need to make it work without him." Albert said, "You have been making it work," she said, "with considerable help," he said, "from someone who was glad to give it." She looked at him and said, "I know. That is what makes it all right to accept." He had been thinking about something for a number of weeks, and he decided that the summer afternoon on her porch, the light golden through the pines, Columbus upside down in the sun with his legs in the air, was the right time to say it. He said, "Margaret, I have been thinking about whether you would consider going up the ridge with me sometime, to see the place. I would like you to see where I live." She looked at him with a thoughtfulness that was different from her usual direct consideration. She said, "You would like to show me your home?" He said, "Yes," she said, "I would like to see it." They went the following weekend. Margaret had never been up the ridge properly, only partway up the trail, and she rode Hector while Albert walked Pease, and they went up through the pine forest in the clear summer morning with the light falling in long columns through the trees. The cabin was above the tree line on a south-facing slope, with a view down the valley that Margaret stopped and looked at for a very long time without speaking. You could see the entire lower valley from there, the ribbon of the creek, the patchwork of the few homesteads including her own, the distant smudge of Harlan Creek's buildings, and beyond it all the haze of the eastern plains. She said, "You can see my cabin from here." He said, "Yes." She looked at him. He said, "I did not plan to watch over you. I simply noticed things. The way you notice things when you have been watching a landscape for a long time." She said, "And you noticed the wood." He said, "I noticed many things. The wood was the one I could do something about." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Thank you, Albert, for noticing." The cabin itself surprised her, she told him later, because it was better than she had expected. Not luxurious, certainly not, but well made and tight and organized in the way of someone who had thought carefully about what they needed and where to put it. There were shelves of tools and shelves of supplies and a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall and threw enormous heat. There were 3 books on a small shelf near the fire, a Bible, a natural history of the North American territories that was worn to softness, and a novel that turned out to be Don Quixote, which made her raise her eyebrows. He said, "A trapper I knew left it with me 10 years ago. I have read it 4 times." She said, "Do you enjoy it?" He said, "I find it instructive." She said, "In what way?" He said, "In that it is about a man who makes up a story about the world and then tries to live inside it, and about how reality is more complicated and more interesting than the story." She looked at him and said, "That is a more thoughtful reading than I expected." He said, "I have had a great deal of time to think about it." They ate lunch at his table, sandwiches she had brought wrapped in cloth, the same brown cloth which he noticed and which made him smile. She explored the garden with the same assessing focus she brought to her own, and she told him exactly what he should plant in addition to the potatoes and turnips, and he wrote it down. They rode back down the mountain in the long summer evening with the shadows stretching east and the world going gold around them, and he rode beside her on peas because the trail was wide enough in the lower section, and their horses walked so close together that their stirrups occasionally touched, and he thought that he had been exactly right about this, about all of it. In July, he brought her a piece of quartz he had found in the Upper Creek bed, shot through with iron pyrite so that it caught the light like something alive. He did not make a ceremony of it. He set it on her kitchen table while she was outside, and when she came in and found it, she picked it up and turned it in the window light and looked at him with the soft expression that she only wore occasionally. She said, "Albert," he said, "the creek turns them up sometimes. The fool's gold makes them easy to spot." She said, "It is beautiful." She put it on the shelf above the stove where she kept things that were not functional but were important. A small framed portrait of her parents, Thomas's pocket watch, and now the piece of quartz. He looked at it on the shelf and felt something that he thought might be the deepest form of satisfaction available to a person, which was the feeling of having contributed to someone's life in a way that they would keep. In August, there was a situation in Harlan Creek that troubled Albert, and that he told Margaret about on a Thursday evening, with more agitation than he usually showed. The railroad survey teams had been moving through the territory for the past year, mapping potential routes for a line that the Northern Pacific Railroad was considering pushing through the Bitterroot region. The surveys involved government assessors who came with the legal authority to evaluate land claims, and who had the power, in cases where claims were technically deficient, to reclassify land as available for acquisition. Albert had heard at the general store that 2 homesteads south of Harlan Creek had already been assessed, and one had been found to have incomplete paperwork and had been taken back into government land. The family had been given 2 weeks to vacate. He told Margaret this, and she listened with a stillness that he recognized as her version of alarm. She said, "Is my claim at risk?" He said, "I think you need to look at the paperwork. Thomas filed the claim in the spring. If there is anything incomplete or incorrect, you need to know about it now, before the assessors reach this part of the valley." She went to the chest where she kept important documents the following morning. She spread the homestead papers on the table, and she and Albert went through them carefully, Albert having had enough dealings with the government land office over the years to know roughly what was required. The claim was mostly in order. Thomas had filed it under the Homestead Act of 1862, which required 5 years of continuous residence and the cultivation and improvement of the land. The paperwork showed the initial filing, the location description, and the witness signatures. But there was a problem. The claim was filed in Thomas's name alone. Margaret's name appeared nowhere on the primary filing. Thomas had died before adding her as a co-claimant, and under the law as it stood, the surviving spouse's claim to the property was dependent on legal processes that had not been completed. Margaret sat back from the papers, and her face was very still. She said, "If the assessors come and the claim is only in Thomas's name and he is deceased, does that mean I could lose the property?" Albert said. "I do not know for certain, but I know you need a lawyer. There is one in Harlan Creek, Thomas Vane. He handles land matters. You should speak to him." She said, "I will go tomorrow." He said, "I will take you." They drove into Harlan Creek the next morning, and Thomas Vane, who was a young lawyer with more competence than his youth suggested, went through the papers and confirmed that the situation was complicated but not necessarily fatal. A widow could claim the property under the homestead law if she could demonstrate continuous occupancy and improvement, which Margaret could certainly do, but the process required filing additional documentation and ideally doing so before any assessment. He said he would prepare the filing and submit it to the land office in Missoula, and that it would be prudent to do so as soon as possible. The fee was not inconsiderable for Margaret's budget. Albert paid half of it before she could protest, and when she did protest on the drive home, he said simply that the homestead was worth saving and that he had the means to help. She said, "You cannot keep doing this, Albert. You cannot keep rescuing me." He said, "I'm not rescuing you, I'm helping you. There is a difference." She said, "What is the difference?" He said, "Rescuing implies you cannot manage. Helping implies you can manage, and it is simply easier with two." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You are a very stubborn man." He said, "I'm a practical one." She said quietly, "All right, thank you." The filing was submitted, and Thomas Vane was cautiously optimistic. The assessors, when they eventually came through that part of the valley in September, reviewed the documentation and found it sufficient. Margaret's claim was confirmed. She told Albert when she got the news, riding Hector up to the ridge to find him because she did not want to wait for Thursday. She came up through the pines with her hair loose because she had not stopped to pin it, and she told him the claim was secure, and he felt the relief of it in his whole body. He said, "Good." She said, "Yes, very good." And then she said, "I have been thinking about something, Albert." He waited. She said, "I have been thinking that perhaps I should not be managing the homestead entirely alone in the long term. Not because I cannot, but because I am beginning to think I would prefer not to." He looked at her standing in the mountain afternoon with the wind moving her loose hair and the pines behind her and the valley below them. He said, "Margaret," she said, "I know this is perhaps faster than is conventional, and I know we have not spoken of it directly, but I think we have been speaking of it in everything we do, and I think we should speak of it plainly." He said, "I agree." She said, "Are we speaking of the same thing?" He said, "I believe so." "If you are speaking of a life together, you are speaking of the same thing I have been thinking about since February." She said, "Since February." He said, "Since the night of the blizzard. When I slept by your stove and ate your eggs in the morning and thought that I did not want to leave." She was very still for a moment, and then she said, "Albert Langston, why did you not say so 6 months ago?" He said, "Because I was not sure you were ready to hear it, and because I wanted to say it when I was sure of what I was saying." She said, "And are you sure now?" He said, "I have been sure for a long time. I wanted to give you the same time." She looked at him with those direct dark eyes, and she said, "I am sure. I have been sure since you wrote down what I said about the garden." He said, "That is a very small thing." She said, "It is not a small thing at all." He understood what she meant. You wrote down what mattered. You carried what you intended to keep. He asked her properly that afternoon, standing on the ridge with the mountains all around them, whether she would marry him. He had no ring because it had not occurred to him until that moment, and he said as much, apologizing for the absence of it. She said it was all right. She did not need a ring. He said he would get one. She said she would prefer he plant the extra garden she had told him about. He said he would do both. She said yes. They were married in October of 1879, 1 year almost exactly from the morning Margaret had found the first cord of wood at her fence post. The wedding was performed by Reverend Alcott in the small church in Harlan Creek, a building that was also used for town meetings and could just barely accommodate the 50 or so people who attended. Berta Hollies cried openly and said she had seen it coming from the moment Albert walked into the general store and bought twice his usual flour in October of the previous year. She was the only one who made this claim. Margaret wore the dark blue dress from the spring gathering, pressed and let out slightly at the sleeves to allow for movement, and she had flowers in her hair that she and Albert had gathered from the last of the mountain meadow blooms at the edge of the hard season. Albert wore his good coat, which Berta had informed him was not good enough, and had been supplemented with a new vest from the general store's limited but adequate selection. He stood at the front of the church and watched Margaret walk down the aisle on the arm of Thomas Vane, who had agreed to stand in as a proxy for a family member, since neither of them had family within 1,000 miles, and he thought that he had been right to come down the mountain on that December Thursday, right to knock on the door, right to say his name. He thought that everything he had learned in 15 years alone had been preparation for knowing what to value when he found it. Reverend Alcott conducted the ceremony with the brevity that Albert appreciated and the warmth that Margaret deserved, and when it was over, Albert kissed his wife in front of 50 people and heard Berta Holly start crying again, louder this time. They went home to the Brenner homestead that evening, which was now also the Langston homestead, though it kept the Brenner name for the land filing. Albert had moved his most essential belongings down from the ridge over the previous weeks, the tools and the books and the dog, and with considerable negotiation, the mules, who had opinions about the lower elevation that they expressed through selective stubbornness. The cabin, with Albert in it, was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. He brought the rest of his things down over the course of November, making multiple trips, and in the process they began to have the kinds of discussions that people who are building a life together have, about where things would go and how the space would be organized, and what would need to change and what would not. The cabin was small for 2 people, and their combined belongings and the dog, and effectively the mules, though the mules lived outside in a 3-sided shelter Albert built against the existing fence. They talked about whether to expand the cabin, and Albert thought they should, not immediately but in the spring, and Margaret agreed. Columbus, after an initial period of suspicion, decided that the chickens were beneath his attention and settled into life at the homestead with the philosophical adaptability that characterized him. The chickens had no opinions about Columbus beyond the initial alarm of the first few visits, which gave way to a professional indifference on both sides. The first winter of their marriage was the happiest Albert had spent. He had thought happiness was something that existed in proportion to the things a man had, and had found it to be entirely separate from that, connected instead to the quality of attention you paid, and the things you were willing to give without calculation. Margaret was not easy in the way of a simple personality. She had a directness that occasionally needed to be met squarely, and would not accept being managed or handled. She had standards for how things were done, and she did not lower them because circumstances were difficult. She was, in the specific sense, the kind of woman who required a man to be fully present rather than nominally so. He found that he was fully present. He found that the directness was something he could meet, and the standards were ones he shared, and that her particular way of existing in the world fit against his in the specific way that 2 pieces of irregular terrain sometimes fit together along a shared edge. They had arguments, mostly about practical things. Once, memorably, about whether to sell the mule Peas, who had been particularly stubborn that winter and had caused Albert to say some words that he did not usually say in company. Margaret said Peas was fine and was simply expressing himself, and Albert said Peas was expensive and required management, and Margaret said all useful things required management, and Albert said that was a philosophical view of mule ownership that he did not share. Peas was not sold. Albert came to terms with Peas in the spring. In the spring of 1880, Albert built the addition onto the cabin. He worked at it systematically through April and May, adding a second room of similar size to the original, with its own small stove and a proper floor and 2 windows that looked out over the garden. Margaret had plans for this room that she had been developing through the winter. She was expecting their first child. The news had come in February, and she had told Albert quietly on an evening when they were sitting by the main stove, the snow pressing in outside, and his response had been to sit very still for a long moment, and then to take her hand and hold it and not say anything for long enough that she asked if he was all right. He said he was better than all right. He said he was struggling to find the right words. She said he did not have to find words. He said, "I want there to be words. I want you to know what this means to me." She said, "Albert." He said, "I have lived alone for a long time, and I have thought of that as a sufficient life because I did not know what I was missing. I know now what I was missing. I am grateful for every version of knowing it." She held his hand back, and they sat in the warm cabin with the winter outside, and he thought that this was the right words, all of it, every bit of it. The child came in August of 1880. It was a difficult enough labor that Albert rode to Harlan Creek at 3 in the morning to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Oakes, who had been attending births in the territory for 20 years, and he spent the hours of the labor doing what men were required to do in that era, which was to stay out of the way and be available and try not to communicate his fear to the woman who was doing the actual work. The child was a boy. Albert stood in the doorway of the new room holding his son, who was red-faced and opinionated already, and he looked at Margaret in the bed, who was exhausted and pale and entirely composed, and he thought that she was magnificent. He said, "What shall we call him?" She said, "I have been thinking about Thomas. For a middle name, not a first. He should have his own first name." Albert said, "What first name?" She said, "I was thinking James, if you like it." He said, "James Thomas Langston." She said, "Yes." He said, "I like it very much." James Thomas Langston was a loud and energetic baby who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's large frame from the beginning, which his father found amusing and his mother found unsurprising. He was also, from the very beginning, enormously interested in everything around him. Albert's adjustment to fatherhood was like his adjustment to most significant changes, which was complete and methodical once he had determined that it was what he intended. He took to it with the same attentiveness he brought to the mountains, careful observation and patient response, and the understanding that you could not force the pace of growing things. You could only provide the conditions. He learned that James had a preference for being carried facing outward rather than inward, the better to see everything. He learned that James was soothed by the sound of Albert's voice specifically, which meant Albert talked more than he had in his life, narrating the tasks of the farm as he did them, describing the mountains visible from the property, explaining the habits of the mules and the philosophies of the dog. Margaret observed this with an expression that he had come to recognize as the specific one she wore when she was moved and was choosing not to make too much of it. She told him once, watching him carry James through the garden in the October afternoon, pointing out the depleted plants and explaining which were annuals and which would return, that she had not imagined him this way. He asked her what way. She said, "This gentle. I knew you were kind, but this is something else." He said, "I am not gentle with most things." She said, "I know, that is why it is remarkable." He thought about that. He thought she was wrong, that it was not a new quality but simply one that had not previously had an adequate object. The years on the homestead built on each other with the deliberate accumulation of lives well tended. Albert made the ride up to the ridge perhaps twice a year now, to check the cabin which he had not sold but used as a hunting base. And on these visits he brought James when James was old enough to sit steady on a horse, which turned out to be younger than Albert expected, because James had strong opinions about horses and a fearlessness in relation to them that Margaret monitored with a careful eye. James was fascinated by the ridge. The first time Albert brought him up, James was 4 years old and sat on the front of the saddle with Albert's arms around him and his eyes very wide at the view from the south-facing slope, the whole valley visible below. He said in the way of a 4-year-old identifying something important, "That is our house." Albert said, "Yes," James said, "it is very small from here." Albert said, "Everything looks small from this high up." James considered this for a moment and then said, "Except the mountains." Albert looked at the mountains and then at his son and said, "That is exactly right." Margaret's sister came from St. Louis in the summer of 1882, an event they had been discussing by letter for 2 years, and which Margaret had been preparing for with a thoroughness that made Albert understand, watching her preparations, that the relationship between the sisters was more complicated than Margaret had let on. The sister's name was Clara, and she was 4 years older than Margaret, and had the bearing of someone who had formed strong opinions about everything in her world, and rarely found occasion to revise them. Clara arrived on the stage from Missoula, and her first impression of Harlan Creek was visible on her face, in the way of someone trying not to show a negative impression, and not entirely succeeding. Her first impression of Albert was also visible, though more carefully controlled, in the way of a woman who had expected something and was adjusting. Albert was not troubled by this. He was aware that he did not make conventional first impressions, and he had long ago decided that conventional first impressions were not worth the effort they would have required. Clara was, once past the initial stiffness, a reasonable woman. She spent 2 weeks at the homestead, and Albert made every effort to be available and hospitable, which for him meant ensuring she was comfortable and answering her questions about the territory with accuracy, and not taking offense when the questions implied a certain skepticism about the life her sister had chosen. On the second to last evening of Clara's visit, while Margaret was putting James to bed and Albert and Clara sat on the porch with cups of coffee in the mountain dusk, Clara said to him, "I want to ask you something directly, and I hope you will take it in the spirit in which it is intended." He said he would try. She said, "When I got Margaret's first letter about you, I was concerned. A man living alone in the mountains for 15 years, no family, no community. I thought she was making a mistake." He said, "And now," Clara was quiet for a moment looking out at the pines. She said, "Now I see that she is happy in a way that she would not have been anywhere else with anyone else, and that you are the same, and I was wrong." He said, "You were concerned for your sister. That is not wrong." She said, "No. But the conclusion I drew was wrong." She looked at him. "You take good care of her," he said. "She takes good care of herself. I simply try to be worth the trouble." Clara smiled, which was the first time she had smiled in his direction without reserve, and said, "She was right about you." He asked what Margaret had said. Clara said, "She said you were the most reliable thing she had ever known. She said you were like geography." He was quiet for a moment. "Reliable like geography," he said. "She said that to Berta Hollies too, before she knew me." Clara said, "Well, she was right before she knew you. She is still right now." That night, after Clara had gone to bed and James was asleep, Albert sat on the porch alone for a while in the quiet and thought about the arc of things, about the 15 years on the ridge and the October morning with the first cord of wood, and the biscuits in the brown cloth and the green scarf, and the coffee on the first Thursday, and all the Thursdays after that, and the dancing and the homestead claim and the wedding and James, and all the days that had followed. He thought that if he had been asked at 19, leaving the Ohio farm, what his life would look like at 36, he would not have imagined any of it. Not the mountain, not the silence, not the solitude, and certainly not this warm house behind him with his wife and his son and the dog sleeping in front of the stove. He thought that the things that mattered most were usually the things you arrived at sideways, not by planning but by being ready to recognize them when they appeared. Margaret came out onto the porch wrapped in her shawl and sat in the chair beside him, and the night was very quiet and very full of stars. She said, "What are you thinking about?" He said, "The first cord of wood." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I wondered sometimes what would have happened if I had gone out to the fence to find out who was leaving it, instead of leaving the biscuits." He said, "What do you think would have happened?" she said. "I think you would have talked to me directly and very briefly, and I would have thought you were impressive and slightly alarming, and we would have gotten to the same place eventually." He said, "I think so too, though it might have taken longer." She said, "The biscuits were better." He said, "The biscuits were the best part." She laughed, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against his side, and they sat in the mountain night with the stars very close overhead, and the pines breathing in the small wind and the world the right size. In 1883, Margaret was expecting again. She told Albert in March, sitting across the breakfast table on a morning when James was outside feeding the chickens with the focused dedication of a 5-year-old who has been given a specific task. Albert received the news with more words this time. He had gotten better at words over the years, not because he had lost his preference for silence, but because he had learned that some things deserved to be spoken and that speaking them was a skill like any other skill which improved with intention and practice. He said he was glad and that he loved her and that he thought James would be an exceptional older brother because he was already an exceptional person in general. She said, "You are not an unbiased source." He said, "No, but I am an accurate one." The second child came in November of 1883 and was a girl. She was born with Albert's gray eyes and a full head of dark hair and a quality of stillness in her first hours that was so opposite to James's noisy arrival that Margaret said she hoped she was not too peaceful, that a little noise was reassuring. She was not too peaceful. She made up for the quiet arrival in the months that followed. They named her Eleanor Ruth Langston, Ruth for Margaret's mother, who had been Margaret's formative model of what a capable woman looked like. Eleanor at 2 was like her father in specific ways that Margaret pointed out to Albert with a kind of delight, which was to say she was observant and deliberate, and not easily hurried, and had strong opinions about what deserved her attention and what did not. She had, at 18 months, decided that Columbus was her specific responsibility, and Columbus, who had never shown strong emotional attachments to anyone except the hearthrug, appeared to find this acceptable and allowed Eleanor to drag him around the property by his collar. James was 7 when Eleanor was born and was initially skeptical of the arrival of a sibling, but came around to a genuine affection within the first few months, partly because Eleanor regarded him with a respect that James found flattering, and partly because he discovered that having a younger sibling to explain things to was satisfying in a way that having things explained to you was not. Albert watched his children grow the way he watched the mountain, with attention and without the urge to intervene in the natural unfolding of things. He taught James to track and to identify plants and to manage the mules, which James approached with the same fearlessness he brought to horses. He taught Eleanor to recognize weather patterns, because she showed an early interest in the sky, and by the time she was 5 she could identify the cloud formations that preceded a storm with a reliability that impressed Albert and delighted Margaret. He built a proper barn in the spring of 1885, a structure large enough for the mules, and for a pair of horses that Albert had acquired in a trade with the livery, a roan mare for Margaret and a steady bay for general use. The barn went up over the course of 6 weeks, and several of the men from Harlan Creek came out to help with the raising, which was the custom, and Margaret fed them all at the long table that Albert had built the previous winter. Berta Hollies came to the barn raising and sat in the yard, and directed the proceedings with the confidence of someone who had been present at enough community events to understand the proper sequence. She was older now, broader, and her sharp eyes missed nothing. She sat with Albert at the end of the day when the barn was up and the other men had gone home and Margaret was inside putting the children to bed. She said, "You have done well by this place, Albert." He looked at the barn and the homestead and the garden, the fence line that had been mended and extended and mended again, the woodpile along the south wall that was always adequate now, the chicken pen that had been expanded twice. He said, "We have done well by it." Berta said, "Yes, both of you." She looked at him. "Do you remember what I said to you at the spring gathering, that I had seen it coming from the October flower?" He said, "I remember," she said. "I was not entirely truthful. I did not see it coming at the spring gathering. I saw it later. I saw it the first time Margaret mentioned you, which was the day after the first cord of wood appeared. She came into the store and she looked different." He said. "Different how?" Berta said. "She looked like someone who had been reminded that the world contained people who paid attention." Albert was quiet for a moment. He said, "Is that what the wood was to her?" Berta said. "That is what the wood was to her, and the biscuits were the same thing back." He thought about this for a long time afterward. The world of the Montana frontier changed around them through the 1880s in ways that were visible from the homestead, if you knew what to watch for. The railroad came through the territory, not through their particular valley, but close enough to change the character of Harlan Creek, which grew in the second half of the decade as people moved along the rail line and settled nearby. New families meant new neighbors and more commerce, and a school, finally, in 1886, which meant that James and Alina no longer had only their parents as teachers. James took to the school with the enthusiasm of someone who had been hungry for organized information. Alina took to it with the critical perspective of someone who was evaluating whether the institution was meeting her standards, which occasionally it was, and occasionally it was not. The school brought new families, including the Sorensen family from Minnesota, who homesteaded 2 miles south of the Langston property, and who had a son of James's age named Eric, with whom James formed a friendship that would last the rest of their lives. The Sorensens were good people, a hard-working couple with several children, and Margaret and the Sorensen wife, Astrid, developed the kind of friendship between neighboring women that is built of shared difficulty and mutual respect, and becomes over time one of the steadier things in a life. Through the late 1880s, Albert watched the territory change with the attentiveness of someone who had known it before the changes. He watched the elk in the high meadows move further up as the lower country grew more settled. He watched the creek levels through the springs and noted which years were dry and which were wet, and recorded this in the notebook, which had become a proper record of 15 years of mountain observation. He still went up to the ridge. He went several times a year, sometimes alone and sometimes with James, and once memorably with both James and Alina on a September morning when the meadows were golden and the elk were in the high country, and Alina had been determined to see them since Albert had described them. They saw 11 elk in the upper meadow, standing in the morning light. Alina sat on the horse behind Albert and was completely still for 5 minutes, watching, which was the longest she had been completely still in Albert's memory. She said very quietly, "They are so large." He said just as quietly, "Yes." She said, "Are they afraid of us?" He said, "They know we are here. They are deciding." She said, "What are they deciding?" He said, "Whether we are worth the trouble of moving away from." She thought about this. She said, "We are not worth the trouble." He said, "Right. So we stay still and they stay where they are and everyone is content." She said, "That is very sensible." He said, "The elk are very sensible animals." She said, "Like you, Papa." James, on the horse beside them, made a small sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. Albert looked at his daughter and said, "I try." The decade turned and became the 1890s, and the frontier became something other than entirely frontier, more settled and more connected, with the telegraph now reliably serving Harlan Creek and a proper road to the county seat, and the school expanded to accommodate the growing population of the valley. Albert was 46 in 1890, and Margaret was 42, and they had lived on the homestead together for 11 years, which felt, when he thought about it, like exactly the right amount of time and also like no time at all. James was 10 and Alina was 7. James was increasingly interested in the ridge and had inherited, in some form, his father's inclination toward the high places, though his version of it was more social. He wanted to know everything about the mountain, but he also wanted to talk about it with everyone who would listen, which was a combination that Albert found both familiar and entirely unlike himself. He told Margaret once that James was what he would have been if the solitude had not suited him so well. She said that was probably an accurate description. He said, "He is going to go somewhere, James." She said, "Yes, I have been thinking the same thing." He said, "You are not worried by that," she said. I am not now, because I think going somewhere does not mean leaving here. I think it means carrying here with him." He thought about Ohio and the farm and the divergence from his brother and the 15 years alone and the slow accumulation that had brought him to this table and this kitchen. He said, "I think you are right," she said. "I usually am." He said, "Usually," she said, "nearly always." He said, "There was the matter of peas." She said, "Peas lived 12 more productive years." He said, "He was never not stubborn." She said, "Reliable things rarely are." He laughed, which was something he did more frequently than he had before she put Biscuits on the fence post, and she looked at him with the expression she wore when she was pleased in a way she was not going to make too great a thing of, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them. The homestead held. The wood was always stacked along the south wall when winter came. Margaret still baked on Thursdays. The kitchen smell of biscuits and pine was the specific smell of that house, the smell that James and Eleanor would carry in their memories for the rest of their lives as the smell of home. Albert never stopped being attentive to the practical needs of the people he loved. He still noticed when the woodpile was low, and when the fence needed mending, and when the trail was treacherous. He still moved through the world with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that care is demonstrated by attention and attention is demonstrated by action. Margaret never stopped being direct. She never stopped having standards, and she never stopped meeting them herself, and she never stopped looking at her husband with the level gaze that required him to be fully present. They were, in the specific way of two people who have learned to fit together along a shared edge, a unit, complete and sufficient and open enough to the world, to receive what the world offered without being diminished by it. On the morning of their 10th anniversary in October of 1889, Albert woke before Margaret, which was unusual, and went out to the porch in the cold morning with his coffee and stood looking at the fence line and the mountains behind it, at the south wall where the wood was stacked neat and tight for the coming winter. He stood there and he thought about that first cord of wood in the dark before dawn, the mules on the trail, the careful stacking, the ride back up with the biscuits in his pocket. He thought about the note she had left, small and clear. "I hope the trail was not too dangerous." He thought about the green scarf, which was somewhere in the house still, worn thin in places but kept. He thought about the quartz on the shelf, and Thomas Vane's paperwork, and Berta Holly's crying at the wedding and the dance, their ungainly and genuine dance in the saloon back room in the spring of 1879. He heard the door open behind him, and Margaret came out with her own coffee and stood beside him in the cold morning air. She said, 10 years today." He said, "Yes." She looked at the fence line. She said, "Do you know what I was thinking about this morning before I got up?" He said, "Tell me." She said, "The biscuits. I was thinking about how carefully I wrapped them. 4 biscuits in the brown cloth tied with kitchen string. I wrapped them as if they were fragile, which they were not." He said, "I ate one standing at the fence post." She looked at him. He said, "The first time. I ate one right there in the dark, standing at the fence post with the mules behind me." She said, "I did not know that." He said, "It was the best thing I had eaten in months." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Even then," he said, "even then." She took his hand, and they stood together on the porch of the homestead that had been Thomas Brenner's and was now theirs, looking at the mountains that had been there before either of them and would be there long after, and the morning light came over the eastern ridge and fell across the frost on the fence and the stacked wood and the whole small good world they had built. Eleanor's voice came from inside, asking about breakfast. James's voice came from the barn, something about the roan mare. Columbus barked once from the hearthrug. Albert squeezed his wife's hand. Margaret leaned against his shoulder. The morning continued, and in the years that followed, the homestead grew and the family grew with it. James eventually went to study in Missoula, returning in the summers and eventually coming back for good, bringing with him a practical and good-hearted woman named Ruth Sorensen, Eric's youngest sister, who had grown up 2 miles south and had always known this land. Elinor grew into a young woman of her father's steady nature and her mother's directness, with an additional quality that was entirely her own, which was a gift for watching the sky and reading it with uncanny accuracy. She helped establish the first proper weather record-keeping system in the county, corresponding with the Weather Bureau in Helena, which was not a common occupation for a woman in the 1890s, but which Elinor pursued with the equanimity of someone who did not expect the world to accommodate her, but was fully prepared to accommodate herself. Albert kept the Ridge cabin until the turn of the century, visiting it each autumn. Each time he stood at the overlook and looked down at the valley and found the homestead, the Brenner Langston place with its barn and its expanded garden and the woodpile along the south wall, and felt exactly what he had felt every time he had looked down at it in the years before he went down and knocked on the door. He felt the rightness of it. He felt the pull of it. He felt, as he always had, that he wanted to be close to it, that it was the place on the landscape that mattered most, that it was worth going down for, that it had always been worth going down for. In the last year of the century, when Margaret was 51 and Albert was 55, and the world was changing in ways that were visible even from the Bitterroot foothills, they sat together on the porch on a warm September evening, with the mountains going pink in the sunset and James and his wife in the house behind them, and Elinor visiting from Helena and Columbus's successor, a young hound named Hector Jr. who had come to them from a litter in Harlan Creek and had inherited the original Hector's name through a logic of sentiment that Albert had not examined too carefully, sleeping at their feet. Margaret said, "We have had a good life, Albert," he said. "We have." She said, "Better than I thought possible in that first winter, after Thomas, when the wood appeared," he said. "Better than I had imagined a life could be from the Ridge," she said. "You thought it from the Ridge," he said. "I thought it was a sufficient life from the Ridge. I did not know then that sufficient and good are not the same thing." She turned to look at him in the evening light. She was 51, and the years were in her face in the way years are in faces that have been lived in fully, in the lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting into mountain sun, and the particular quality of someone who has known difficulty, and also known the thing on the other side of difficulty. She was, he thought, as she had always been since the first December Thursday, more vivid than his imagination had managed. She said, "What made the difference between sufficient and good?" He knew the answer completely. He said, "You left biscuits on the stack." She laughed, the real laugh, still warm, still immediate. She said, "You brought the wood in the first place." He said, "Somebody had to." She said, "Albert Langston. Someone who was not you might have let me manage." He said, "Someone who was not me would have." She took his hand, the same as she had the first time, her palm up and her fingers closing around his. She said, "I am glad it was you." He said, "So am I, Margaret." "So am I." The sun went down over the mountains and the pines went dark and the evening sounds of the valley came up, the creek and the night birds, and from inside the house the voices of their son and his wife and their daughter, 3 generations of this place, this chosen ground. The wood was stacked along the south wall. The kitchen smelled of biscuits. The mountains stood as they had always stood. And Albert Langston held his wife's hand on the porch of the home that had waited for him at the bottom of the ridge, the whole life of it patient and warm, exactly as it should be, now and going forward, closed and full and entirely good.